So now to round out this series, I want to talk a little bit about the late game. The point in time where you enter the late game is a little bit ambiguous, and I think it comes down to feeling a lot of the time. It was easy enough in the mid-game guide to say, like, okay, when either your tower or their tower gets knocked down, you've freed up some space for you to wander around the map. And even if it's not true that that is literally the mid-game, like, some of the time, it's still, like, a very usable benchmark that is true more times than not. The late game, I feel like, is marked by like a period of time where the power levels of the heroes are getting to such a point that it is no longer viable to really be alone, like off farming jungle camps or split pushing lanes or anything like that. Because if the enemy team were to group as 6 and just storm the gates, they would basically be able to wipe out your team and end the game before you were able to really threaten anything on your own. So I think the late game is defined by a period of time where team fighting is basically no longer negotiable. It's mandatory. And so I think a lot of navigating the late game comes down to the ways that you are preparing for these team fights that are going to happen. Now, the first thing we'll talk about is just buying items that solve problems. And admittedly, if you're new to MOBAs or if you're new to Deadlock and you don't know what all of the items do, super fair, super reasonable. This isn't going to be incredibly accessible to you. I apologize. This is just something that comes with time. But I wanted to talk about it a little bit and give you some ideas to start off with, just because it's something that you're going to have to think about at some point. So when I'm talking about proactively trying to solve problems, this is something that kind of happens tangentially with the mid game as you're progressing later into the game. And it's looking at like the enemy team and like holding shift. And if we bought a bunch of items, then like these 3 bars would have 3 different colors. It would be orange, green, and purple. And so we would be looking at the strongest players on the enemy team, and we would be trying to figure out if they're doing more physical damage or if they're doing more spirit damage. And in that way, trying to buy some sort of mitigation that would help us deal with some of the stronger members on their team. So if, for example, the strongest players on their team are like Hayes, then maybe we want to get this bullet armor relatively early on, transition it into having improved bullet armor later on, because we know Hayes, she doesn't really have the capacity to do a whole lot of spirit damage. She's pretty much just going to be doing physical damage, so getting some kind of mitigation to help you in that regard is really, really useful. On the exact opposite side of the coin, most of the really successful Grey Talon builds right now are spirit-based. So if we hold shift, we see that the Grey Talon is pulling ahead. They're using a lot of purple items. They've got a lot of spirit. Then we do the exact opposite. We buy some improved spirit armor. Just try to mitigate and prepare for the bursts of damage that are going to be coming our way. We're also trying to solve the problems for our team as best as we can, while acknowledging that like you can't do everything for everyone. So we'll stay with the same example, like the Hayes is pulling away. Hayes, again, just to talk about her kit, she's got the knife that she throws, it sleeps a single person. She has the stealth mode that gives her a speed boost. She's got a left click modifier that just gives her left clicks a little bit of spirit damage. And she's got the ult, which is, we'll just say it, it's kind of like the, what's the shotgun guy from Overwatch? Reaper. She's got like the Reaper ult where she spins around in a circle and shoots people a bunch of times, and that's all physical damage as well. So again, pretty much entirely physical damage. So if we're trying to solve this problem, and we're trying to solve it for the entire team, then one of the better items that we could try to buy is something like Knockdown. So Knockdown is only 3,000, so it's relatively efficient for solving this problem. You channel it for 2 seconds, or I guess it's got a 2-second delay. It doesn't say it's channeled, but you just knock an opponent down and stun them. So as Hayes is, she's spinning around, she's doing her ult, you use this on her, boom, she's knocked down. You potentially save your entire team from eating this ult, right? Does take 2 seconds, so it's not like the perfect solution, but it's still better than, not having a solution at all. But let's say Hayes, on the exact opposite side of the team, is trying to get ahead of that exact issue. They think like, okay, we're getting to a point, I know I'm the problem. I'm doing a lot of physical damage. A lot of it's coming from this ult. They're going to try to interrupt the channel. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to buy Unstoppable. So this is basically double the cost of Knockdown. It's 6,300, but the active, it's got a 60-second cooldown. Suppress negative status effects and become immune to stun, silence, sleep, roots, and disarm. So basically, before she goes to ult, she just activates this, and then you can't interrupt her at all, right? So this is what I mean by you buy items to attempt to solve the problem for as much of your team as possible, while acknowledging that the opponent can do the exact same thing and try to outmaneuver you, right? So we'll continue with this example. You bought knockdown, cool. Haze is now bought unstoppable to try to counter it. Boo. Now we kind of just have to try to solve the problem for ourselves. Metal Skin is a pretty good option. So we use the active, we become immune to bullets and melee attacks. We basically just shrug off all physical damage, right? So this solves the problem for ourselves. And, you know, we could maybe just like entirely skip the knockdown and get the metal skin and just be like, oh, we're safe. But again, it's worth it to like try to solve the problem for as many people on your team as possible before saying like, okay, like I'll just fix it for my own personal character, right? So I understand that this is something that again, is not going to come naturally if you're like brand new to MOBAs or brand new to Deadlock. You don't know what all the items in the game do yet. Totally fair. But it's still worth talking about because the items that you're bringing to these late game team fights really, really matter. And if we're still talking about this example, like you bought knockdown, they bought unstoppable, you bought metal skin, you've solved the problem for yourself. Okay, you still have knockdown. Now you're trying to look for another target on their team that has a channeled ability that you can try to interrupt. Maybe like the Mo and Krill isn't incredibly fed. They're not, they're not like going to run away with the game or anything, but they don't have unstoppable, so I can try to prevent him from ulting on one of my teammates or something like that. You just try to think about what you're going to use these items on before you get into the fight, so that once you're in the fight, it's not like a muddled, confusing mess. Another thing is, as we're approaching these late game team fights, you want to try to have in mind like who your main targets are. So I think it's a really common misconception and like misplay that some teams will do to try to focus the strongest person on the enemy team. I've heard people in comms be like, oh, this Shiv is literally their entire team. You know, they're 17 and 0 and 7. Like if we just kill this guy, like the rest of the game will be easy, right? And so they'll try to focus the strongest player on the team. This is the exact opposite of what we want to do, right? First off, if they're like alone and you can just get a pick, then that's totally fine. Like they're alone, just jump them, just kill them, right? But if we're talking about a team fighting situation, you don't want to try to focus all of your attention on the guy that is going to be the hardest to kill. In the mid-game guide, we talked about how even if you aren't particularly ahead in terms of resources, if you have abilities that come with crowd control, you can still be useful in a team fight. You can still knock people up, you can still stun people, you can still silence them, you can still root them, and it can be helpful enough for the people who are far enough ahead to be able to help them win the team fight, right? The same is true in the late game. So if you are dumping all of your resources in trying to kill the person that is the absolute hardest to kill and ignoring the useful targets to them that are possible to kill, then that is the exact wrong way to go about it. Instead, what you want to do is try to figure out who on their team is like the most reasonable target for you to kill while still being reasonably high value, and trying to get all of the other teammates off of the board, basically, so that once like the Shiv is alone, like obviously if we're 5v1ing, like we can win that. That's very doable. It doesn't matter how fed he is. There's 5 of us here, right? So this is like a much shorter video. I don't feel like there's a whole lot to talk about with the late game. I guess the other thing we could talk about is the mid boss. The mid boss is kind of like the we're gonna try to win the game now objective. It's a big booger monster in the middle of the map, and all he really does is when you kill him, there's a big gem that drops down, you do a heavy melee on it, skadoosh, and it basically gives your entire team like a really fast revive. So because you have a really fast revive, and I think you don't give souls to the enemies that kill you while you have it. I could be wrong about that, don't quote me on that. But you kill this guy, you get a revive, and then you all just sort of run at the enemy base, run at an objective, and even if you all die, you just all instantly respawn, so there's basically no risk to it at all. So if you're able to win a fight and it's in the middle of the map, you don't feel like you can literally go and end the game, you take the mid boss instead, and then that should be enough leverage to help you close out the game. And if you win a fight and it's close enough to the enemy base, then you just try to end the game, try to close it out before they revive. But like if you're like at the enemy gates, like say you're up here by these towers up here, and you win a team fight, don't like run back and try to get the mid boss, like just try to close out the game. And conversely, if you're like here in this blue lane that's relatively shoved up and you win a fight, don't try to push this lane all the way to the enemy base and try to end the game. Just take the mid boss, because it's going to give you enough leverage to probably close the game anyway. So yeah, those are the big things. Again, this is probably the shortest video just because like a lot of the late game and the mid game share a lot of the same principles. A lot of the things that we talked about in the mid game are still going to be true here. The major things that aren't true anymore is that like it's now no longer really feasible for a player on your team to be off split pushing alone. You know, if the enemy team, they're strong enough at this point that if all 6 of them gather and they just want to force an objective, then they're going to get the objective unless all of you respond and try to stop it in kind. And trying to proactively prepare for those team fights is really just the biggest thing. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.